Teething Ring by James Causey. Anyone can make an error, but the higher the society, the more disastrous the mistake. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. Teething Ring by James Causey. Half an hour before, while she had been engrossed in the current soap opera, and Harry Jr. was screaming in his crib, Melinda would naturally have slammed the front door in the little man's face. However, when the bell rang, she was wearing her new Chinese red housecoat, had just lustered her nails to a blinding scarlet, and Harry Jr. was sleeping like an angel. Yawning, Melinda answered the door, and the little man said, beaming, "Excellent day! I have gewgaws for information." Melinda did not quite recoil. He was perhaps 5 feet tall, with a gleaming, hairless scalp and a young, old face. He wore a plain gray tunic, and a peddler's tray hung from his thin shoulders. "Don't want any," Melinda said flatly. "Please." He had great, beseeching amber eyes. "They all say that. I haven't much time. I must be back to the university by noon." "You're working your way through college?" He brightened. "Yes, I suppose you could call it that. Alien anthropology major." Melinda softened. The initiation those frats pulled nowadays, shaving the poor guy's head, eating goldfish, it was criminal. "Well," she said grudgingly, "what's in the tray?" "Langlers," said the little man eagerly. "Oscilloscopes, portable force field generators, a neural distorter." Melinda's face was blank. The little man frowned. "You use them, of course. This is a Class 4 culture." Melinda essayed a weak shrug, and the little man sighed with relief. His eyes fled past her to the blank screen of the TV set. "Ah, a monitor," he said, smiling. "For a moment I was afraid. May I come in?" Melinda shrugged, opened the door. This might be interesting, like a vacuum cleaner salesman who had cleaned her drapes last week for free. And Kitty Kyle Battle's life wouldn't be on for almost an hour. "My name is Porteous," said the little man with an eager smile. "I'm doing a thematic on Class 4 cultures." He whipped out a stylus, began jotting down notes. The TV set fascinated him. "It's turned off right now," Melinda said. Porteous' eyes widened impossibly. "You mean," he whispered in horror, "that you're exercising Class 5 privileges? This is terribly confusing. I get doors slammed in my face when Class 4s are supposed to have a splendid gregarian quotient. You do have atomic power, don't you?" "Oh, sure," said Melinda uncomfortably. This wasn't going to be much fun. "Space travel?" The little face was intent, sharp. "Well," Melinda yawned, looking at the blank screen, "they've got Space Patrol, Space Cadet, Tales of Tomorrow." "Excellent. Rocket ships or force fields?" Melinda blinked. "Does your husband own one?" Melinda shook her blonde head helplessly. "What are your economic circumstances?" Melinda took a deep, rasping breath and said, "Listen, mister, is this a demonstration or a quiz program?" "Oh, my excuse. Demonstration, certainly. You will not mind the questions?" "Questions?" There was an ominous glint in Melinda's blue eyes. "Your delightful primitive customs, art forms, personal habits." "Look," said Melinda crimsonly, "this is a respectable neighborhood, and I'm not answering any Kinsey report. Understand?" The little man nodded, scribbled. "Personal habits are taboo. I so regret. The demonstration." He waved grandly at the tray. "Anti-grav sandals, a portable solar converter. Apologizing for this miserable selection, but on Capella they told me—" He followed Melinda's entranced gaze, selected a tiny green vial. "This is merely a regenerative solution. You appear to have no cuts or bruises." "Oh," said Melinda nastily, "cures warts, cancer, grows hair, I suppose." Porteous brightened. Of course, I can see you scan. Amazing. He scribbled further with his stylus, glancing up, blinking at the obvious scorn on Melinda's face. Here, try it. You try it. Now watch him squirm. Porteous hesitated. Would you like me to grow an extra finger? Hair? Grow some hair. Melinda tried not to smile. The little man unstopped the vial, poured a shimmering drop on his wrist, frowning. Must concentrate, he said. Thorium-based suspended solution. Really jolts the endocrines. Complete control. See? Melinda's jaw dropped. She stared at the tiny tuft of hair which had sprouted on the bare wrist. She was thinking abruptly, unhappily, about the chignon she had bought yesterday. They had let her buy that for $8, when with this stuff she could have a natural one. How much? She inquired cautiously. Half an hour of your time only, said Porteous. Melinda grasped the vial firmly, settled down on the sofa with one leg tucked carefully underneath her. Okay, shoot, but nothing personal. Porteous was delighted. He asked a multitude of questions, most of them pointless, some naive, and Melinda dug into her infinitesimal fund of knowledge and gave. The little man scribbled furiously, clucking like a gravid hen. You mean, he asked in amazement, that you live in these primitive huts of your own volition? It's a GI housing project, Melinda said, ashamed. Astonishing. He wrote feudal anachronisms and atomic power side by side. Class 4s periodically rough it in back-to-nature movements. Harry Jr. chose that moment to begin screaming for his lunch. Porteous sat trembling. Is that a security alarm? My son, said Melinda despondently, and went to the nursery. Porteous followed, and watched the ululating child with some trepidation. Newborn? 18 months, said Melinda stiffly, changing diapers. He's cutting teeth. Porteous shuddered. What a pity! Obviously atavistic. Wouldn't the creche accept him? You shouldn't have to keep him here. I keep after Harry to get a maid, but he says we can't afford one. Manifest insecurity, muttered the little man, studying Harry Jr. Definite paranoid tendencies. He's 2 weeks premature, volunteered Melinda. He's really sensitive. I know just the thing, Porteous said happily. Here. He dipped into the glittering litter on the tray and handed Harry Jr. a translucent prism. A neural distorter. We use it to train regressives on Rigel 2. It may be of assistance. Melinda eyed the thing doubtfully. Harry Jr. was peering into the shifting crystal depths with a somewhat strained expression. Speeds up the neural flow, explained the little man proudly. Helps tap the unused 80%. The pre-symptomatic memory is unaffected due to automatic cerebral lapse in case of overload. I'm afraid it won't do much more than cube his present IQ. An intelligent idiot is still an idiot, but... How dare you? Melinda's eyes flashed. My son is not an idiot. You get out of here this minute and take your things with you. She reached for the prism. Harry Jr. squalled. Melinda relented. Here, she said angrily, fumbling with her purse. How much are they? Medium of exchange? Porteous rubbed his bald skull. Oh, I really shouldn't. But it'll make a wonderful addendum to the chapter on malignant primitives. What is your smallest denomination? Is $1 okay? Melinda was hopeful. Porteous was pleased with the picture of George Washington. He turned the bill over and over in his fingers and at last bowed low and formally apologized for any taboo violations and left via the front door. Crazy fraternities, mumbled Melinda, turning on the TV set. Kitty Kyle was dull that morning. At length, Melinda used some of the liquid in the green vial on her eyelashes and was quite pleased with the results and hid the rest in the medicine cabinet. Harry Jr. was a model of docility the rest of the day. While Melinda watched TV and munched chocolates, did and redid her hair, Harry Jr. played quietly with the crystal prism. Toward late afternoon, he crawled over to the bookcase, wrestled down an encyclopedia, and pawed through it, gurgling with delight. He definitely, Melinda decided, would make a fine lawyer someday, not a useless putterer like Big Harry, who worked all hours overtime in that damned lab. She scowled as Harry Jr., bored with the encyclopedia, began reaching for one of Big Harry's tomes on nuclear physics. One putterer in the family was enough, but when she tried to take the book away from him, Harry Jr. howled so violently that she left well enough alone. At 6:30, Big Harry called from the lab with the usual despondent message that he would not be home for supper. Melinda said a few resigned things about cheerless dinners eaten alone, hinted darkly at what lonesome wives sometimes did for company, and Harry said he was very sorry, but this might be it, and Melinda hung up on him in a temper. Precisely 15 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Melinda opened the front door and gaped. This little man could have been Proteus double, except for the black metallic tunic and the glacial gray eyes. "Miss Melinda Adams?" Even the voice was frigid. Yes? Why?" "Major Nord, Galactic Security." The little man bowed. "You were visited earlier this morning by one Porteous." He spoke the name with a certain disgust. "He left a neural distorter here, correct?" Melinda's nod was tremulous. Major Nord came quietly into the living room, shut the door behind him. "My apologies, madam, for the intrusion. Porteous mistook your world for a Class 4 culture instead of a Class 9. Here." He handed her the crumpled dollar bill. "You may check the serial number. The distorter, please." Melinda shrunk limply into the sofa. "I don't understand," she said painfully. "Was he a thief?" "He was careless about his spatial coordinates." Major Nord's teeth showed in the faintest of smiles. "He's been corrected. Where is it?" "Now look," said Melinda with some asperity. "That thing's kept Harry Jr. quiet all day. I bought it in good faith, and it's not my fault. Say, have you got a warrant?" "Madam," said the Major with dignity, "I dislike violating local taboos, but must I explain the impact of a neural distorter on a backwater culture? What if your Neanderthal had been given an atomic blaster? Where would you have been today? Swinging through trees, no doubt. What if your Hitler had force fields?" He exhaled. "Where is your son?" In the nursery, Harry Jr. was contentedly playing with his blocks. The prism lay glinting in the corner. Major Nord picked it up carefully, scrutinized Harry Jr. His voice was very soft. "You say he was playing with it?" Some vestigial maternal instinct prompted Melinda to shake her head vigorously. The little man stared hard at Harry Jr., who began whimpering. Trembling, Melinda scooped up Harry Jr. "Is that all you have to do? Run around frightening women and children? Take your old distorter and get out. Leave decent people alone." Major Nord frowned. If only he could be sure. He peered stonily at Harry Jr., muttered, "Definite egomania, but doesn't seem to have affected him. Strange." "Do you want me to scream?" Melinda demanded. Major Nord sighed. He bowed to Melinda, went out, closed the door, touched a tiny stud on his tunic, and vanished. "The manners of some people," Melinda said to Harry Jr. She was relieved that the Major had not asked for the green vial. Harry Jr. also looked relieved, although for quite a different reason. Big Harry arrived home a little after 11. There were small worry creases about his mouth and forehead, and a leaden cast of defeat in his eyes. He went into the bedroom, and Melinda sleepily told him about the little man working his way through college by peddling silly goods, and about the rude cop named Nord. And Harry said it was simply astonishing, and Melinda said, "Harry, you had a drink." I had 2 drinks, Harry told her owlishly. You married a failure, dear. Part of the experimental model vaporized. Whoosh. Just like that. On paper, it looked so good. Melinda had heard it all before. She asked him to see if Harry Jr. was covered, and Big Harry went unsteadily into the nursery, sat down by his son's crib. Poor little guy, he mused. Your old man's a bum, a useless tinkerer. He thought he could send a man to the stars on a string of helium nuclei. Oh, he was smart, thought of everything. Auxiliary jets to kick off the negative charge, bigger mercury vapor banks, a fine straight thrust of positive alpha particles. He hiccuped, but his face was in his hands. Didn't you ever stop to think that a few air molecules would defocus the stream? Try a vacuum, stupid. Big Harry stood up. Did you say something, son? Griffle, said Harry Jr. Big Harry reeled into the living room like a somnambulist. He got a pencil and paper, began jotting frantic formulae. Presently he called a cab and raced back to the laboratory. Melinda was dreaming about little bald men with diamond-studded trays. They were chasing her. They kept pelting her with rubies and emeralds. All they wanted was to ask questions, but she kept running, Harry Jr. clasped tightly in her arms. Now they were ringing alarm bells. The bells kept ringing, and she groaned, sat up in bed, and seized the telephone. Darling, Big Harry's voice shook, I've got it. More auxiliary shielding plus a vacuum. We'll be rich. That's fine, said Melinda crossly. You woke the baby. Harry Jr. was sobbing bitterly into his pillow. He was sick with disappointment. Even the most favorable extrapolation showed it would take him 19 years to become master of the world. An eternity. 19 years. The end of Teething Ring by James Causey. With a Vengeance by J.B. Woodley. Keep this in mind in teaching apprentices. They are future journeymen and even masters. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. With a Vengeance by J.B. Woodley. October 10th, 2119, New San Francisco. Today at precisely 9:50 a.m., Kyle became first Imperator of Terra. His coup was so fantastically direct and facile that I am almost tempted to believe the old cliché, the time was right. Well, however badly it can be expressed, I suppose the world was ripe for this sort of thing. I can remember when much the same used to happen in elections. One man would win over another by a tremendous majority, and historians would then set about to show how the time was right. Why do I persist in tormenting myself with that phrase? Analytically, I might say I resent the new aristocracy of politics. Specifically, I might say I resent Kyle. And both are true. Both are true. This swing, though, to absolute monarchy, complete with the installation of the Kyle dynasty, damn him, this is something psychologists, not historians, must explain. Has the age of the common man, so bravely flaunted for over 100 years, truly come to nothing? Would people really prefer a figurehead and a symbol of undisputed authority? In this instance, one may again conclude that the time was right. Contact with the planets like Mars and Venus undoubtedly had its influence. I must confess that the televised audience with the Mert of Venus and the Znam of Mars did make Terra's president, should I say late president, look a bit seedy. I dare say there is such a thing as a too common man. Kyle was such 20 years ago. His name wasn't Kyle then, although it was something very like that. I must see if any of the old ledgers are about. I'd like to see what the Imperator's name was when His Most Imperial Majesty was an apprenticed nobody. October 12, 2119, New San Francisco. I found it, buried in the stacks of dust behind the old printing press that was once the heart of my Beacon Sentinel. There were others there, too. Spent a delightful morning with them, reading back through those old account books. I wonder whatever happened to Hastings and Drew. Best linotype man I ever had. They became pilots or something, as I recall. Too bad, too bad. They could have had such brilliant futures, both of them. Why they felt they must ally themselves with the non-thinking, muscle-flexing variety of mankind, of which our new ruler is an excellent example, I'll never know. Ah, yes, Kyle. In those days he was Kilmer Jones. I don't remember him too well, actually, except the day I fired him. I suppose he was right in changing his name. We couldn't very well have an imperator named Kilmer the First or Jones the First. Much too common, not at all in keeping. Gawky fellow, that Kilmer. When Bard brought me a sample of his work, I guess I'll have to call it that, we both had a good laugh over it. Atrocious spelling. Couldn't follow the proofreader's marks. Indeed, I wondered if the fellow could even read. The punctuation and the grammar. I called the boy into the office that morning, or was it the next day? No matter. I called him in and told him, as kindly as possible, that I thought there were other vocations to which he might be better suited. The irony of it all. Kilmer Jones, Kyle the First. And he stood there, I remember, with those 17-year-old hands that were all knuckles and bone and chapped skin, twisting those hands and shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Please, Mr. Booth," he said, his voice cracking, "I ain't got no other job in mind. I want to be a newspaper man. I ain't got no—" If not for that "ain't got no," I think I might have relented. But no one is going to ruin the English language as he did. Not in my offices. I took him to task severely for his offensive usage, outlining a correct example of what he had attempted to say, gave him a brief lesson in the history of the tongue, and explained why it had been chosen as the official Terran speech. I think my conclusion was, "You'll be much better off in a position which requires you to quote neither Milton nor Shakespeare, nor any author save possibly those who write the comic strips." "Got no training," he said softly. I suppose it was to keep his voice from exhibiting its usual adolescent gymnastics. I shuddered slightly. I remember. "You mean I have no training?" "Yeah," softly again. "Yeah, Mr. Booth." "Yes," I cried impatiently. "Not yeah, but yes." I searched for his severance pay on my desk, wondering who the devil had hired him in the first place. Gave him 3 weeks' pay, as I recall, one more than necessary. Unmannerly pup, he just stood there for a minute, and then finally left without even a thank you or goodbye. And this is the man who is Kyle the First, ruler of Terra at the age of 37. I wonder what he is like now. January 1, New San Francisco. There is no longer any need to wonder. Surprisingly, few heads have rolled, but apparently Jonesy chose to exhibit his power in other ways. Thanksgiving Day, a custom preserved in certain portions of the Directorate of North America, is 3 weeks away, even though it is January. The year 1. There used to be some childish joke about the year 1. Don't remember it just now. Thanksgiving harvest in January. Christmas celebrated in February. Spring planting in July. To say nothing of the inconvenience this has caused my bookkeeping department. I suppose the man will now try to change the weather to suit his new calendar. January 8, New San Francisco. He can't last. He can't. A dictator is one thing, a monarch is another. But Kyle is something else. Naturally, he had to remove certain persons on his way. And his summer palace in the Plains region of America, that's all right. That's all right. An authority of Kyle's stature is expected to remove undesirables, and have a summer palace, and a winter palace, and anything else he wants. Of course. But why this? Why this of all things? No newspapers. Just like that. He waves an edict, and just like that, no newspapers. The Beacon Sentinel has been a great paper for the last 25 years. It was nothing, and I was nothing, and together we became a voice. And now, again, we are nothing. Oh, I see what's behind it. It's revenge. That's what it is. Because he once couldn't become a newspaper man, he's taking his vengeance this way. A man as petty as that shall be overthrown. Mark my words. And the clumsiness of it. I see what he is. I know him. He's still that pup of 17, playing king of the world, twisting his hands gleefully over his childish triumph. No subtlety. Just a direct pushing over of an apple cart he couldn't steer. Doesn't matter whose apples you destroy, does it, Jonesy? Just push it over. Push it over. January 16, 1. New San Francisco. Closed the Beacon Sentinel yesterday. My savings are enough to take care of me for a few years. After that, well, I'm no longer a young man. I am glad that Elsa is not here to see this. February 12, 1. New San Francisco. Received a letter this morning requesting me to appear in the chambers of His Most Imperial Majesty Kyle I on Tuesday of next week. His Most Imperial Majesty can see me between 10:15 and 10:25 in the morning. 10 minutes. Rather a brief spell in which to roll another head. I find myself amazed, though. Is this man so truly powerful that he needs no police to make arrests for him? Can he really send messages via jet mail and be certain his enemies will not try to escape? I don't want to attempt flight. Life without my work is no longer life. February 17, 1. Kylington Palace, North America. I don't understand. I've gone over it twice and I don't understand. If only Elsa were still with me, I could talk to her. She would help me decipher what it's all about. This morning at 10:15 sharp, I was taken to the public audience chamber in the palace. His Majesty was seated behind a desk facing the doors. Behind him, on the wall, was his coat of arms. He stood up and walked toward me, waving away the guards. "How are you, Mr. Booth?" he said, and offered me his hand. I recovered my presence of mind, of course, and replied as was fitting. And then he said, "I shall be at liberty later this week to discuss more fully the details of these past years." Shades of ain't got no. Meanwhile, my secretary will give you a complete dossier on my planned official bulletin. He lighted a cigarette after offering me one. I should deem it an honor, he continued, to have a man of your literary versatility and, I must add, your vast practical experience become chief editor of the bulletin. The publication, which I should enjoy christening the Terran Beacon Sentinel, with your permission, sir, shall be more than my official organ. It shall set the standards for the coming newspaper world. He cocked an eyebrow at me and smiled. I believe we are in perfect accord about certain standards, are we not, Mr. Booth? The deplorable grammatical practices of some newspapers. Well, really, Mr. Booth, I feel assured of your agreement. He led me around the desk and pointed to the coat of arms. As he stood silently, I felt obliged to look more closely. I had seen it before, of course, but seeing it now greatly enlarged, I was able to make out its details. What I had thought was a mere decorative border, I now realized was a motif I had seen all my life. A tiny lighthouse sending forth a beam, the trademark of my paper. As I stood there, gaping, His Majesty laughed softly and said, "That, Mr. Booth, I felt impelled to include, for without your most fortuitous termination of my apprenticeship in your organization, I would not have risen to my present position." Again he took my hand and shook it warmly. His hair was just a bit gray at the temples, and there were signs of strain on his finely featured face. Those awkward hands were now strong and purposeful. He apologized that he must return to his duties, and went with me to the door. My secretary will fill in further details about your new position. Newspapers shall once again be published. No, don't say a word, Mr. Booth. I know what you're thinking. Your salary, he continued, as we stood at the open door, shall of course be commensurate with your high authority in this new field. Allow me, now, to thank you most deeply and sincerely for your unwitting aid in my youth. I assure you, Mr. Booth, I have often thought of the day we talked, and I hope to repay you in some measure for what you did." He said more, mostly polite phrases of goodbye, and then I was outside after being handed a folder by some man. An official jetmobile took me to my residence, which turned out to be in the East Wing. Here I am, and I don't understand. I came prepared to suffer heaven only knows what as part of Kilmer Jones' childish pattern of revenge. Instead, here am I, head of the official bulletin, titular ruler and ruler in fact of the future journalism of the world. There is something behind this. I keep feeling there is. But what? What? Or is he truly generous to a degree never before known among absolute monarchs? February 13, 1. Kylington Palace, North America. I am a suspicious and most humble old man. I see now that Kyle's generosity amazed me only because I myself would have been incapable of such an action. Just now I fear for His Majesty. I was right before when I said there is no subtlety in the man. He is too open, too fair, too forgiving. A ruler of such greatness of heart might easily allow some small, insignificant person in too far, too close. I fear for him. February 14th, 1. Kylington Palace, North America. Today we begin publication. The press room is magnificent. I can hardly wait. It's been a long time since I felt such exuberance. This afternoon I am to conduct a conference of some 800 editors. His Majesty's Secretary has sent me an outline on journalistic standards, which I will study after lunch. There is a note attached, in His Majesty's handwriting. Such beautiful penmanship, too. A mere formality, it says, for of course you and I know full well what the future of journalism shall be, Mr. Booth. Later. How wrong can one man be in one lifetime? I wonder now why he changed the calendar. I wonder now what poor devil he destroyed then. But I'll cheat him. I'll cheat him yet. Obituary, Turin Beacon Sentinel, February 16th, 1. The unfortunate and untimely demise of George W. Booth is hereby noted with sorrow for those who knew him and loved him. Mr. Booth, former editor and publisher of the Beacon Sentinel of New San Francisco, Directorate of North America, had apparently been in poor health for some time. It is believed that the worry over the success of his new policy setting Turin Beacon Sentinel was a contributing factor to his suicide late in the afternoon of February 14th. His Most Imperial Majesty Kyle I is ordained a fitting monument to his late-lamented friend. A simple shaft of granite shall be erected in the garden facing the west wing of Kylington Palace, where Mr. Booth made his residency. On that shaft shall be inscribed the legend, "How bounteous mankind is, all brave new world that has such people in it." The quotation is from The Tempest. Mr. Booth was a great admirer of Shakespeare. A vin more fitting and long-lived memorial is expressed in the relace through the office of His Majesty on the very day of Mr. Booth's death. It reads in part, "The new linguistic policy on Tura, as demonstrated in the Turin Beacon Sentinel, shall henceforth be known as Booth Talk. Mr. Booth befriended our imperial ruler in his younger days, and as we all know, His Majesty never forgets a friend." End of With a Vengeance, by J.B. Woodley.
Zaritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. Zaritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. Why bother building a time machine when there's something much easier to find right in your own kitchen? Somebody, someday, will make a study of the influence of animals on history. Although not as famous as Mrs. O'Leary's cow, Mrs. Graham's cat should certainly be included in any such study. It has now been definitely established that the experiences of this cat led to the idea of quick frozen people, which, in turn, led to the passage of Zeritsky's Law. We must go back to the files of the Los Angeles newspapers for 1950 to find the story. In brief, a Mrs. Fred C. Graham missed her pet cat on the same day that she put a good deal of food down in her home deep freeze unit. She suspected no connection between the two events. The cat was not to be found until 6 days later, when its owner went to fetch something from the deep freeze. Much as she loved her pet, we may imagine that she was more horror than grief-stricken at her discovery. She lifted the little ice-encased body out of the deep freeze and set it on the floor. Then she managed to run as far as the next-door neighbor's house before fainting. Mrs. Graham became hysterical after she was revived, and it was several hours before she could be quieted enough to persuade anybody that she hadn't made up the whole thing. She prevailed upon her neighbor to go back to the house with her. In front of the deep freeze they found a small pool of water, and a wet cat, busily licking itself. The neighbor subsequently told reporters that the cat was concentrating its licking on one of its hind legs, where some ice still remained, so that she, for one, believed the story. A follow-up dispatch, published a week later, reported that the cat was unharmed by the adventure. Further, Mrs. Graham was quoted as saying that the cat had had a large meal just before its disappearance, that as soon after its rescue as it had dried itself off, it took a long nap, precisely as it always did after a meal, and that it was not hungry again until evening. It was clear from the accounts that the life processes had been stopped dead in their tracks, and had, after defrosting, resumed at exactly the point where they left off. Perhaps it is unfair to put all the responsibility on one luckless cat. Had such a thing happened anywhere else in the country, it would have been talked about, believed by a few, disbelieved by most, and forgotten. But as the historic kick of Mrs. O'Leary's cow achieved significance because of the time and place that it was delivered, so the falling of Mrs. Graham's cat into the deep freeze became significant because it occurred in Los Angeles. There, and probably only there, the event was anything but forgotten. The principles it revealed became the basis of a hugely successful business. How shall we regard the Zeritsky brothers? As arch-villains or pioneers? In support of the latter view, it must be admitted that the spirit of inquiry and the willingness to risk the unknown were indisputably theirs. However, their pioneering, if we agree to call it that, was, equally indisputably, bound up with the quest for a fast buck. Some of their first clients paid as high as $15,000 for the initial freezing, and the exorbitant rate of $1,000 per year as a storage charge. The Zeritsky brothers owned and managed one of the largest quick freezing plants in the world, and it was their claim that converting the freezing equipment and storage facilities to accommodate humans was extremely expensive, hence the high rates. When the early clients who paid these rates were defrosted years later, and found other clients receiving the same services for as little as $3,000, they threatened a row, and the Zeritskys made substantial refunds. By that time they could easily afford it, and since any publicity about their enterprise was unwelcome to them, all refunds were made without a whimper. $3,000 became the standard rate, with $100 per year, the storage charge, and no charge for defrosting. The Zeritskys were businessmen first and last. Anyone who had the fee could put himself away for whatever period of time he wished, and no questions asked. The ironclad rule that full payment must be made in advance was broken only once, as far as the records show. A certain young man had a very wealthy uncle residing in Milwaukee, whose heir he was, but the uncle was not getting along in years fast enough. The young man, then 18 years old, did not wish to waste the best years of his life as a poor boy. He wanted the money while he was young, but his uncle was as healthy as he was wealthy. The Zeritsky's were the obvious answer to his problem. The agreement between them has been preserved. They undertook to service the youth without advance payment. They further undertook to watch the Milwaukee papers until the demise of the uncle should be reported, whereupon they would defrost the boy. In exchange for this, the youth, thinking of course that money would be no object when he came out, agreed to pay double. The uncle lived 17 years longer, during which time he seems to have forgotten his nephew, and to have become deeply interested in a mystic society, to which he left his entire fortune. The Zeritskys duly defrosted the boy, and whether they or he were the more disappointed is impossible to imagine. They never forgot the lesson, and never made another exception to their rule. He, poor fellow, spent the rest of his life, including the best years, paying off his debt, which, at $3,000 plus 17 years at $100 per year, and the whole doubled, amounted to $9,400. The books record his slow but regular payments over the next 43 years, and indicate that he had only $250 left to pay when he died. We may, I think, assume that various underworld characters who were grateful ex-clients of the Zeritskys were instrumental in persuading the boy to keep up his payments. Criminals were the first to apply for quick freezing, and formed the mainstay of the Zeritsky's business through the years. What more easy than to rob, hide the loot, except for that all-important advance payment? Present yourself to the Zeritskys and remain in their admirable chambers for 5 or 10 years, emerge to find the hue and cry long since died down and the crime forgotten, recover your haul, and live out your life in luxury? Due to the shady character of most of their patrons, the Zeritskys kept all records by a system of numbers. Names never appeared on the books, and anonymity was guaranteed. Law enforcement agents, looking for fugitives from justice, found no way to break down this system, nor any law which they could interpret as making it illegal to quick freeze. Perhaps the truth is that they did not search too diligently for a law that could be made to apply. As long as the Zeritskys kept things quiet and did not advertise or attract public attention, they could safely continue their bizarre business. City officials of Los Angeles, and particularly members of the police force, enjoyed a period of unparalleled prosperity. Lawyers and other experts who thought they were on the track of legal means by which to liquidate the Zeritsky empire found themselves suddenly able to buy a ranch or a yacht or both, and retire forever from the arduous task of earning a living. Even with a goodly part of the population of Los Angeles as permanent pensioners, the Zeritsky fortune grew to incredible proportions. By the time the Zeritsky brothers died and left the business to their sons, it was a gold mine, and an inexhaustible one at that. During these later years, the enterprise began to attract a somewhat better class of people. Murderers and other criminals continued to furnish the bulk of the business, but as word of this amazing service seeped through the country, others began to see in it an easy way of solving their problems. They were encouraged, too, by the fact that the process was painless and the firm completely reliable. There were no risks, no accidents, no fatalities. One could, in short, have confidence in the Zeritskys. Soon after Monahan's great exposure rocked the nation, however, many of these better type clients leapt into print to tell their experiences. One of the most poignant stories came from the daughter of a Zeritsky client. Her father was still, at the age of 102, passionately interested in politics, but the chances of his lasting until the next election were not good. The daughter herself suggested the deep freeze, and he welcomed the idea. He decided on a 20-year stay because, in his own words, "If the Republicans can't get into the White House in 20 years, I give up." Upon his return, he found that his condition had not been fulfilled. His daughter described him as utterly baffled by the new world. He lived in it just a week before he left it, this time for good. She states his last words were, "How do you people stand it?" Some professional people patronized the Zeritskys, chiefly movie stars. After the exposé, fan magazines were filled with accounts of how the stars had kept youthful. The more zealous ones had prolonged their screen lives for years by the simple expedient of storing themselves away between pictures. We may imagine the feelings of their public upon discovering that the seemingly eternal youth of their favorites was due to the Zeritskys and not, as they had been led to believe, to expensive creams, lotions, diet, and exercise. There was a distinctly unfavorable reaction, and the letter columns of the fan magazines bristled with angry charges of cheating. But next to criminals, the majority of people who applied for quick freezing seems to have been husbands or wives caught in insupportable marital situations. Their experiences were subsequently written up in the confession magazines. It was usually the husband who fled to Los Angeles and incarcerated himself for an appropriate number of years, at the end of which time his unamiable spouse would have died or made other arrangements. If we can believe the magazines, this scheme worked out very well in most cases. There was, inevitably, one spiteful wife who divined her husband's intentions. By shrewd reasoning, she figured approximately the number of years he had chosen to be absent, and put herself away for a like period. In a TV dramatization rather pessimistically entitled "You Can't Get Away," the husband described his sensations upon being defrosted after 15 years, only to find his wife waiting for him right there in the reception room of the Zeritsky plant. She was as perfectly preserved as I was, he said. Every irritating habit that had made my life unbearable with her was absolutely intact. The sins of the fathers may be visited on the sons, but how often we see repeated the old familiar pattern of the sons destroying the life work of the fathers. The Zeritsky brothers were fanatically meticulous. They supervised every detail of their operations, and kept their records with an elaborate system of checks and double checks. They were shrewd enough to realize that complete dependability was essential to their business. A satisfied Zeritsky client was a silent client. One dissatisfied client would be enough to blow the business apart. The sons, in their greed, overexpanded to the point where they could not, even among the four of them, personally supervise each and every detail. A fatal mistake was bound to occur sooner or later. When it did, the victim broadcast his grievance to the world. The story appeared in a national magazine, every copy of which was sold an hour after it appeared on the stands. Under the title, "They Put the Freeze on Me," John A. Monahan told his tragic tale. At the age of 37, he had fallen desperately in love with a girl of 16. She was immature and frivolous, and wanted to play around a little more before she settled down. "She told me," he wrote, "to come back in 5 years, and that started me thinking. In 5 years I'd be 42, and what would a girl of 21 want with a man twice as old as her?" John Monahan moved in circles where the work of the Zeritskys was well known. Not only did he see an opportunity of being still only 37 when his darling reached 21, but he foresaw a painless way of passing the years which he must endure without her. Accordingly, he presented himself for the deep freeze, paid his $3,000 and the $500 storage charge in advance, and left, he claimed, written instructions to let me out in 5 years, so there'd be no mistakes. Nobody knows how the slip happened, but somehow John A. Monahan, or rather the number assigned to him, was entered on the books for 25 years instead of 5 years. Upon being defrosted and discovering that a quarter of a century had elapsed, his rage was awesome. Along with everything else, his love for his sweetheart had been perfectly preserved, but she had given up waiting for him and was a happy mother of 2 boys and 6 girls. Monahan's accusation that the Zeritskys had ruined his life may be taken with a grain of salt. He was still a young man, and the rumor that he received $100,000 for the magazine rights to his story was true. As most readers are aware, what has come to be known as Zeritsky's Law was passed by Congress and signed by the President 3 days after Monahan's story broke. 75 years after Mrs. Graham's cat fell into the freezer, it became the law of the land that the mandatory penalty for anyone applying quick freezing methods to any living thing, human or animal, was death. Also, all quick frozen people were to be defrosted immediately. Los Angeles papers reported that beginning on the day Monahan's story appeared, men by the thousands poured into the city. They continued to come, choking every available means of transport, for the next 2 days, until, that is, Zeritsky's Law went through. When we consider the date, and remember that due to the gravity of the international situation, a bill had just been passed drafting all men from 16 to 60, we realize why Congress had to act. The Zeritskys, of course, were among the first to be taken. Because of their experience, they were put in charge of a military warehouse for dehydrated foods, and warned not to get any ideas for a new business. End of Zeritsky's Law by Anne Griffith.